Hello, welcome to the greenhouse here at Temple University Ambler. My name is Ben Snyder, and I'm the manager of the Greenhouse Education Research Complex and an adjunct instructor for the Landscape Architecture and Horticulture programs. Currently, we hold over 1,500 different taxa or types of plants in our greenhouse collection. These plants are used by our students, faculty, and researchers to study various plant forms, habits, and other features throughout the year. With World Water Day coming up, we're going to be looking at some of the interesting water plants we have growing in our greenhouse collection. Another name that is commonly used for water plants, or other plants that require high amounts of water, is hydrophyte. So these plants are often found growing in or immediately around water or wet areas. The term hydrophyte is derived from the Greek hydro for water and phyton, which is Greek for plant. So these types of plants have different methods of coping with excess water and low oxygen levels around their roots. So typically a normal plant would have oxygen pockets, air in the roots and the soil. But for hydrophytes in their wet environment, the area that would typically have the oxygen is taken up by water, so they need to come up with mechanisms to cope with that. One of the ways they deal with this is having relatively large stomata or breathing pores on the upper surface of the leaves. This is a very different feature than many other non-hydrophyte plants. So this is something that our students and researchers can look at in our greenhouse collection. So the first plant we're going to look at today is Egyptian papyrus, Papyrus papyrus. So some of you may have heard of Egyptian papyrus scrolls and wonder where that came from. That is actually made from this plant. So this plant here with these fine grass-like leaves, this is our Egyptian papyrus. So it's native to Africa and is related to sedges. So some of you may be familiar with common garden sedges that you might use outdoors in your landscape in Pennsylvania. We also have native species of sedges in the Cyperaceae family, so they're all related to this plant. So most sedges will spread by rhizomes. Some are clumping, but some are rhizomes. So this is one of the rhizome species. And this will spread to form large colonies along the Nile River in its native habitat. It is not hardy around here, so it would need to be taken in for the winter, but it is very ornamental. It's a relatively large plant. It can grow up to 15 feet tall. So you can see there are lots of stems closer to the ceiling of our greenhouse. So botanically, these triangular stems, these really thick green stems here, those are actually photosynthetic. That's a lot of how the plant photosynthesizes and gets its energy is by those green photosynthetic stems. And then it also has this tuft of fine feathery leaves at the very tip of each of those stems as well. So sedges in general are not grown for their flowers. They're relatively inconspicuous, not very showy. They're wind pollinated, so they don't need to be very colorful. They're not trying to attract insects. Their main goal is to produce pollen and disperse that pollen to other flowers. As I already mentioned, this plant is what paper and papyrus scrolls were made out of. So they take these triangular stems, dry them, pound them, and weave them into a textile-like fabric, pound them smooth, and then once they're dry, they can be used like paper. The rhizomes of this are also edible. They're very starchy, so they can be either eaten raw or cooked and prepared. So a very versatile plant. I already mentioned it is also very ornamental, so you can find it for sale as an ornamental plant for the summer months, as a tropical container plant. Now there are dwarf cultivars. One would be Prince Tut, which only reaches 3 feet tall, as opposed to the full-size plant that can get to 15 feet tall. So the next plant we're going to look at is another papyrus. This is the umbrella plant, the Papyrus involucratus. So it's in the same genus as the Egyptian papyrus. Looks relatively similar, has the same growing requirements. You'd find it in riparian areas along waterways. This one is native to Eastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Some of the differences are that this has wider leaf blades, so you can already see that instead of these fine grass-like leaves that we saw in the Cyperus papyrus, these have much wider, broader leaves. So this gives it a more of an umbrella-like appearance, which is where it gets the common name umbrella plant from. It's also a lot denser than the Egyptian papyrus, so it forms a dense clump, much thicker, much more visually stands out a little bit more. The cool thing about this plant is it can be propagated by taking one of these heads of leaves and bending them down, either putting it in wet soil or directly in water. So you can already see that our plant here, as it grows, it tends to arch over. We actually have ours tied to the wall so it doesn't fall into the pathway. But in its native habitat, each of those stems would bend over, fall over, and eventually touch the ground and root and grow and start a new plant. So the plant essentially walks along the riverbanks, and that's how it colonizes. So it's kind of a fun project if you want to try to propagate a plant, something a little different to try. Like the Egyptian papyrus, this is grown often as an ornamental in cooler climates. It will need to be brought in for the winter as it's not hardy, but does make a really good houseplant as long as you keep it relatively wet. This one's actually growing in standing water. So you just get a big saucer of water and keep watering the bottom of it, and they'll be very happy with that. There also is a variegated form of this, but it tends to not be very stable. It tends to revert back to the straight species being green, so it doesn't stick around that long, but it is very pretty. So the next plant we're going to look at is a variegated giant reed or variegated Mediterranean reed. So botanically, this is Arundodonax variegata. Forms these really tall stalks. You can see really pretty variegated leaves. In the wild or outdoors, it can grow up to 20 feet tall. Obviously, in here, it's going to be a little bit shorter. It is actually hardy in zones 6 to 10. So if it's in a protected area, you can grow this outdoors. There are a couple downsides to that, though. So this particular plant is in the Poaceae or grass family, and spreads very aggressively by underground rhizomes. So it is not a bamboo, but it has similar habits to a bamboo. Small stem and root sections can detach and grow very readily. So if you think about this plant growing in a riparian area along a river or a stream, that's very beneficial to that plant. So if there's a big flood event or rain event, and parts of this plant get washed away or broken apart, each of those little pieces can grow and recolonize riverbank following the flood. But in areas where it is not native, that can become a problem. So this plant is listed as a noxious weed in several U.S. states because of how readily it repropagates and how much it can outcompete native plant species in those environments. So because of that, you really don't want to plant this outdoors. If you really want to grow it in a container so it doesn't escape. Make sure to dispose of all plant parts appropriately. But aside from its invasive potential, this plant does have a cool history. So this species was historically the source of musical reeds for woodwind instruments. So these stems are hollow, so you can cut this main stem apart and make the musical reed out of it for the instruments. So it does have some unique history to it as well. So this may be a plant that you're familiar with if you have an outdoor pool or pond that you put plants in over the summer. So this is water lettuce, Pistia stradioides. So this is a member of the Araceae or arum family. So there's a lot of common houseplants in this family. Think philodendrons, peace lilies, anthuriums. There's also a lot of hardy native outdoor plants as well, like skunk cabbage and jacinpulpit, that are also in this family. So this is a floating plant native to Africa's Lake Victoria. It's hardy in zones 8 through 10. It multiplies very rapidly by division. So you can sort of see here it just multiplies and covers the entire surface of the water. This is a floating aquatic plant. So the ones we've looked up at until this point have all been growing in really wet, mucky soil. This plant will actually just grow in water on the top of the surface and doesn't need soil at all. So it is used in aquatic environments for ponds, fish ponds, things like that, because it does shade the water surface. It covers the top of the water, and in doing so, prevents algae growth and things like that, so it helps keep the water cleaner. It also has long fibrous roots that dangle below the water surface and can provide habitat for fish and other pond creatures that you may want to have in your pond. But again, like the Arundodonax, this is non-native, and because of how readily it propagates and spreads, it is considered noxious weed in parts of the United States. It will clog waterways. It's a big problem down south. along with water hyacinth, another aquatic floating plant. So if you want to use it, just be mindful of making sure it doesn't escape and mindful of where it is invasive in the US. So the last plant we're going to look at is a native plant to this region. So we've talked about a couple invasive wetland plants, certain things like that. So now we're going to finish up with a native species. So this is Carolina mosquito fern, Azolla caroliniana. So like the water lettuce, this is another floating aquatic hydrophyte, native to much of the mid and eastern United States. Just its common name actually is very descriptive. So this is a true fern. So maybe you're familiar with woodland ferns and a couple of fern houseplants. But this is actually a true fern that grows floating on top of the water surface. So it reproduces by spores, just like any other true fern. So it doesn't flower, it only has spores. And can form these really dense, thick mats that just float over the surface of the water. So you can see here, this is just a tub of water, and this fern has completely covered it. It's actually starting to grow up the sides of the container. So this plant is very unique in that it has a symbiotic relationship with a blue-green alga called Anodana azollae. So that bacteria, or that alga, actually lives on the undersides of the fronds, under the water surface, and can fix or capture nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into a form that the plant can then use as a fertilizer. So you may have been familiar with legumes or Fabaceae members, like beans, peas, things like that, that are able to fix or capture atmospheric nitrogen and then use it as fertilizer. So it's the same process with this fern. So this process in general allows plants to thrive in areas where normally plants wouldn't grow that well. Very nutrient poor, nutrient deficient soils. Because of this relationship with the alga or bacteria, it can capture nitrogen from the air, turn it into a usable form, and use it as its own fertilizer. Because of this, for this particular plant, the floating fern, it can actually be used as a cover crop or a natural fertilizer in rice paddy fields. So when they flood the paddy fields, they can introduce this floating fern, let it grow, let it fix some nitrogen, and then drain the paddies and let this fern sink to the bottom, till it in, and then you essentially have your own nitrogen fertilizer that's created by a plant. So that's some of the commercial uses for it, but besides that, it is a very attractive, aesthetically pleasing plant. In aquascapes, it serves the same purpose as the water lettuce, so it will shade the water surface and keep down algae growth, so it keeps your water cleaner, and is native and not invasive, so it would be a great alternative. In full sun locations, it will get a reddish tint to it, so it'll turn this purplish red color. That's essentially this plant's version of sunscreen. So those red colorings that reflects sunlight out of the plant and prevents the plant from burning. So it just gives it a little different color. Other than that, it's a really cool plant to have around. Not many people are familiar with it, but it's very, very cool, very unusual, and really unique looking. So I hope you've enjoyed this tour of some of the hydrophytes in our greenhouse collection, and learning about how they function and some of the different methods they use to cope with these very wet environments.